Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I think we're always looking for models, exemplars, people of substance, representative figures who can tell us something about how life ought to be lived.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Sister Geraldine Nowak, who is a pastoral associate at St. Ignatius Catholic Church in Oregon, Ohio. Father Bacik and Sister Nowak will discuss Mary of Nazareth, model of contemplation. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Geraldine, I'd like to talk a little bit about Advent, and the Advent season raises up for us the great figures from the past. In the office, we're reading from the great prophet Isaiah. He's an Advent figure because he has a great sense of preparing the way for the Lord. And John the Baptist is another one. We talk about him as the herald, the messenger, the prophet who comes before Jesus and prepares for him. And surely one of the great figures of Advent is Mary of Nazareth, and she's highlighted in the liturgies for the fourth Sunday of Advent, where we read a bit about her visitation to Elizabeth. So she hears that Elizabeth is indeed pregnant, one of the signs given to her by the angel, the workings of God's will in the world. And so Mary proceeds in haste, as Luke tells us in his first chapter, into the hill country to a town of Judah to go to see Elizabeth and her husband Zechariah. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Mary as an Advent figure and see if we can't find some enlightenment from her as we try to deal with the season of Advent and the preparation for Christmas. You want to make any comments here about Mary as an Advent figure?
Well, first of all, yes, I would like to make some comments about Mary, but what you had previously mentioned was the idea of mentioning all those people, and I wouldn't like to bypass that. I think that's a way to have us get in touch with the meaning of the season, and that we're always then a special grace comes to us by reflecting on all of these people, and I think we go away with a reverence for our traditions and our ancestors, and that we always have to bring them before us so that they don't sort of succumb into just memories and powerless shadows. And so I'm happy that you mention all of those figures. It's for myself, I have to just not jump into who those people are, but what they represent, the importance of our tradition, those people, that it's a constant revelation. We come at that new again, based on real people that really lived many of the themes that are part of our own day. And so then when we mentioned all of those and sort of zero in on Mary, it's just sort of a grace-filled time to be grateful for these people, that they did live in a concrete way, all the various rhythms and movements of the spiritual life and the gospel as they experienced it from Christ.
That's an important idea. I think maybe we should spend a little more time on it. The importance of tradition and the way the liturgical year works for us. It appears as though Advent is one of the richer liturgical seasons. I find a lot of people who really get into it and find it to be interesting. And one of its strengths, as you point out, are these flesh and blood individuals. When you start talking about them, it's possible to know something about their life and their history, their personal struggles, the societal situation in which they lived, and we begin to maybe get more of a feel for all of that. I think we're always looking for models, exemplars, people of substance, representative figures who can tell us something about how life ought to be lived. And I guess the Church picks these particular figures like Isaiah and John the Baptist and Mary because they bring out that waiting theme or that preparation idea. They're all people who somehow are preparing for that coming of the Lord. And that, of course, is what we're trying to do during Advent, is prepare for the coming of the Lord in grace in our lives, to be more attuned to the presence of Christ in our daily activities. It is a season of waiting and preparation and anticipation. So those people seem to be very good at that. I mean, you could look more closely at John the Baptist and see that clearly. I mean, he's really out there doing the baptizing, and here comes Jesus, and John the Baptist has to sort of, as I say, get off center stage. He's the great hero to the crowds, but he has to point to another and say, not me, this fellow. I really feel that strong temptation that the Baptist would have known to be the center and maybe lead the movement and help establish the kingdom, a man of such energy and drive and ambition in one way, and yet he's willing to step aside and to let the Lord take over. Surely a kind of temptation that we would all have in our lives, to remain on center stage, and call always being to move aside and to make sure that we point to the Lord. I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me. He becomes the center point of the whole thing, as Paul reminds us.
And it's remarkable how when we hear about John the Baptist, given our own life and the rhythm of our own life, that one year it might be John the Baptist who speaks to us clearly, another year it might be Isaiah and all the images he presents, and another year it might be Mary. And I guess just with all of those, the importance, I think you had alluded to this once in an All Saints liturgy, that while we need models and heroes and heroines, that it really is a difficult thing to just set up one person, because there isn't any just one person that contains all of what we model after. And I like that because it seems to be a healthy thing. I like to look at various people because there are, each person has something to give, some particular focus. And in that way then too, I think that's where we can relate and say that, I may not be able to do all these things, but, I do have my particular gift that I can offer to others, and I can witness in some way. I can't do all of it because maybe my gifts aren't there. So just the importance of, once again, all of those people, and then how in a given lifetime or a given day or moment or season, maybe some particular person maybe strikes us given our own life situation.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and each of those people will have their strengths and weaknesses, and I think that's part of the wisdom of life, is being able to discern that and to sort of get in tune with it. I think that same thing goes just in our ordinary relationships of people who are living now, and very often it seems healthy to take them at their strength rather than their weakness. We can learn a lot from people, even people who are struggling or don't have it all together. It's not necessary to have it all together to be a model of some particular virtue. And I think the Advent figures function that same way. I mean, not everybody's going to be eating grasshoppers and wearing a camel hair coat, a rough garment, as the Scriptures tell us. I mean, and living in the desert. I mean, we're not going to do that, and yet there's something that he tells us about discipline that probably all of us could learn. Let's look more closely now at Mary of Nazareth, certainly a key figure in the whole history of salvation, such an important person, and the Mother of God, as the Council of Ephesus reminded us, and as the Second Vatican Council reminded us, an exemplar and prototype for the whole Church, an example of what Christ can do for all of us, we see as we look at Mary. So let's talk a little bit more about Mary of Nazareth and see what she might tell us in this whole business of making the most of Advent and preparing for Christmas.
We have a nice gospel reading from Luke, and in that we have the familiar scene of the visitation, Mary going to visit Elizabeth. And I think that's really, the visitation has been something that artists and poets have long sort of thought about, reflected on, and have captured that in art and in story. Just recently I was reading Henry Nouwen's latest book, The Road to Daybreak, and he relates where this has always been one of his favorite passages, and he's recalling the fact that Mary said yes to God and that Elizabeth said yes to God, and that's why in a certain sense they needed each other. And he talks about that element of community, how in living out their yes they had to search for people who understood the yes or the intimacy of that yes. So Mary and Elizabeth become very, very important to each other, and Mary then spends 3 months or so visiting with Elizabeth and being with Elizabeth, but the intimacy that they shared because of what God was doing in their life. And as Henry Nouwen concludes, that the movement there is the need for community, the need for others, and the sharing out of those movements with others in our relationship to what God is doing within us.
We might imagine Mary, after saying her own yes, as you put it, in the Annunciation, when the angel comes to her and says that she is to be the mother of the Messiah, she's questions that, probes it, has her own moments of doubt, I suppose, but comes up with a ringing affirmation that she is the servant of the Lord, and then wants the Lord's will to be done in her. It's a marvelous statement, and one, I guess, imagines her then wanting to be in kinship with and community with someone else who's is also following the will of the Lord. It says something to me about the need at times to be with people who share our values or have the same general approach to life. I think that we often find that to be energizing and gives us a sense that we're not alone in the struggles. I think that's what happens when we're with people who like to talk our language or to have our values or that use the same symbols that we use. We sense a kinship, and maybe that's part of what's happening with Mary and Elizabeth in the visitation. One might imagine their conversations and talking about their own struggles and trying to say something of what their deepest religious experiences meant to them. A lot of times today, it seems what we're looking for is that kinship at a deeper level. So often I run into people saying, well, my life's so superficial, or we only talk about things that really don't count that much, busy work and mundane things. And there's sort of a hunger or thirst for deeper conversation very often. And maybe that's part of what we see in Mary's model here of going to be with her cousin Elizabeth in the midst of all of this and to share at a deeper level.
Well, I agree with you of our own need to be with people that, as you say, understand our language and speak our symbols. And recently I've had the opportunity to do some ministry in the area of spiritual direction, and I guess that happens in a formal sense, but it also many times happens informally when we gather with those people that we can share our deeper self with, and as you say, the importance of that, and at times maybe even planning to do that as a way of nourishing ourselves. It's always very, very fruitful to go away, and I think what we do after those conversations then is we begin to reflect, because we're reflecting on the meaning in our lives. Someone once said it to me that not only many times do we reflect on the meaning that we're looking for and the searching for meaning, but many times we're also looking at the meaning that's searching for us. And we kind of search all that out together, and how helpful and clarifying it is to do. And as you say, Mary and Elizabeth must have experienced some of this in that time that they shared together.
Yeah, that's a good aspect of this whole story that you bring out. Let's look at some other things that Mary might tell us. One of the things that I think is important when we talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary is that we see her in sort of an active role. Her great Magnificat poem that put on her lips in the gospel maybe brings to mind something about Mary's sense of justice and her work for justice in the world. I mean, it's a great story that talks about God being on the side of the poor and attending to the poor and the problems of oppression and so on, and it sort of gives one the sense that, well, we ought to be in tune with all of that. So I think one of the dangers, in other words, when we start talking about Mary and taking up her traditional roles or the traditional understandings of her, is that she ends up being too passive and so on in her outlook on the divine-human relationship. And I want to make sure we don't fall into that trap, that we make sure that we see her as one who is seeking after justice, who understands that the poor have difficulties in life and that we need to be on their side and seeing what we can do about all of that. I think that's a great side to Mary, and one that we really ought to keep in mind. I notice there's a lot of books and articles written along that line these days. I think much of it comes from the feminist literature and the people who, want to make sure that Mary is put up as a role model for women today, and not just as sort of a passive, dependent person, but as one who took hold of life, had her own ideas, and in this case that I'm talking about, had a sense of the whole problem of social injustice.
The Pax Christi people have done a wonderful service for us. I think within our tradition we're familiar with a type of prayer that's called a litany, the constant repetition under various titles, and I know that is within our tradition familiar to many, and that prayer is a very, very pleasing prayer. And what the Pax Christi people have done is to take that litany of Mary and to emphasize just the point that you are articulating, and that is that Mary isn't that sort of passive, wishy-washy, the whole thing you mentioned about the feminist movement. And so they refer to her many times as a model of strength, gentleness, trust, courage, patience, risk, openness, stubbornness, perseverance. I think those are kind of gutsy qualities, and it sort of is, I'm grateful that they took the time to do that, because it does sort of move Mary into a more contemporary setting. Or they talk about her as a mother, and a mother of those, of the liberating people, mother of the homeless, the dying, the nonviolent, the widowed mother, the unwed mother, the mother of a political prisoner, the mother of the condemned, or the mother of an executed criminal. That certainly puts a lot of guts into that, doesn't it, just to speak in those titles. So yet then the other side of that too, where she's just not a passive person, where she was a woman of contemplation and vision, wisdom and understanding. She was pregnant with hope, and she certainly was always centered in God.
Yeah, that brings out well, I think, that whole active side of Mary, a very self-actualized person. I think we get a sense of a woman who had great possession of herself and an ability to see the world in terms that were realistic, and to try to do something about that. So with that sort of larger perspective on Mary, I think we can go back to another quality that we would find in her that seems so important to us, and that is the contemplative spirit. Because Mary is an example and model for prayer. I guess a lot of times we envision her as being the one who, because she had a prayerful life and was attuned to the world of the Spirit, that when the angel came to her in the Annunciation, she's prepared to respond, and out of that inner strength that she's developed and that openness to God, she's able to say yes and at that time of the Annunciation. So she becomes a model of the contemplative spirit that we need so much during this Advent season. So, Geraldine, why don't we explore that a little bit, the contemplative side of Mary?
Well, that flows very nicely, because right after this passage of the Visitation, what occurs in Luke is Mary's great prayer of the what we've called often the Magnificat, where she, then I think responds in a way where, to me, it's a way that she had to be reflecting on what was happening in her life. It's certainly a good example. She somehow puts into words just all of what God has done in her life, and she responds to that, and the greatness of that, or the awe of that. So there's that movement, I think, between some activity that takes place in our life, and then we sort of need a space to kind of think about that, and then we find expression of that, and that in-between space between the Gospel of the Visitation and what we come to read as what we've often called the Magnificat. I think that space in between is where the contemplation is going on. And Doris Donnelly, in some of her literature, refers to the idea that Mary was able to do that. Obviously, she at the time was pregnant, and so she was very much, Doris talks about the idea of three elements being present there, which led her to contemplate that whole idea of what she received from God, and then sort of the treasuring of that, and then the idea of giving forth. So those three particular movements are maybe some ways...
Say those again. Maybe we can do more with that.
Well, it would be the idea of, Mary was very, very much in tune and in touch with the fact that she had received something from God. She was now to be the mother of God. So the very fact that she was receptive and she accepted, so that very gift that was given to her, and then she sort of treasures that. She kind of keeps it. She cherishes what has happened. And then the natural response is to do something with that, to give forth something. And obviously Christ then, in being Christ for us, and Mary giving us Christ in terms of motherhood. So just those kind of movements maybe are some ways to sort of maybe get a handle on how does one contemplate. We look at that as it happens in Mary, but then I think we need to apply that to our own life situation and life experience, and kind of look out of those experiences, and then that's somehow how we can get into the contemplative mode.
Yeah, well, maybe we need to do a little bit with that even word contemplation and so on. A lot of times if we hear that word, we think about monks in a monastery maybe, or people who have all kind of time to sit around and do meditation. But I think that word contemplation suggests a goal for all of us. It is to be more attuned to the presence of God in our everyday activities. It's to have our heart quieted a little bit. It's the opposite of just being harried and frenzied in life and running around and being involved in the rat race and losing focus and being at loose ends. All of those things that seem to happen so much during the month of December and in the preparation for Christmas. The word contemplation sounds like an antidote to that. It's the opposite way of living. To be contemplative in today's world means that we have some focus, that we have an inner life, that we're acting out of some inner strength, that we know we are able to be quiet and to be silent for a while. We're able to receive and to be open to whatever God's gifts are for us. So we get a whole different feeling and mood around that notion of contemplation. And so I don't think it's just monks in a monastery, but it's sort of an ideal for all of us. Our problem is it's so hard to do. I mean, we're busy and got demands on our time and energy. It's hard to stay focused like that or to get quiet. I mean, sometimes our mind's racing all over the place, and you get a couple minutes of silence, and it's hard to relax because we're so distracted and so on. So it's almost something that we got to work at or try to develop, it would seem, in the modern world, to know how to get silent and quiet and receptive and open, even in the midst of a very busy and demanding life.
And I've heard someone define contemplation once as that ability to take the long, loving look. And
your voice is going to fade there. The long,
loving look, and that maybe that's a better way to talk about what we mean by contemplation, because I think we do attribute that to people who spend just hours and hours and hours in quiet. And I've known people I in my lifetime that I think that experience certainly begins that way, and we do have to spend time. But because these people have spent time and have taken long, loving looks at life, at situations, at nature, then what it really does is it almost becomes second nature. And these are the people that I admire, that in the midst of their great busyness, they can be caught up in all kinds of tasks to do and so on, and all of a sudden something captures their attention and they can spend 30 seconds on it, and yet it's that contemplative mode, that long loving look that they have seen that with, and it then goes on to really mean a lot more. And I think we can do that. I think we just, as you say, we have to develop a style for that. And I think that happens just very easily, just driving a car, and when you stop for a red light, just to kind of look around and be aware of who are the people on the street, what are the sights and the sounds and the smells of the particular street that I'm on, or if it's waiting for a train. I think I try to use those as sort of a way to be contemplative in the midst of my own busy day. Occasions that present themselves when we want to do something and we're caused to have to wait for something, to sort of turn that around and use that as a way to focus in on something, even if it's 30 seconds.
I mean, when I'm standing in line waiting for something, I shouldn't get all upset, but use it as a time for reflection and so on, and maybe even say a prayer. That would be a novel idea, Geraldine. I mean...
Well, I think it's natural to get upset because we're busy and we have all these various things to do, and I think it is novel, but I know of many people that really deliberately try to work on that, and as a way, then they say it does work, that you can stand in line, and all of a sudden, when one is out shopping or doing things and you're on a certain time schedule, and we certainly all do that, to all of a sudden transform something, like catch the person's smile, or if that person looks down, to kind of say something to them. So while it might be novel, I do know many people that work at that, and that it does work.
There really is hope along that line. They've done studies of people with type A personalities. Type A personalities do not tend to be so contemplative. They're busy and a lot of energy and goal-directed and always in a hurry and so on. And it really is possible to change those behavior patterns. That they've found ways to help people quiet down a bit and move through life at a slower pace and be more aware of what's going on. So I do think we can make progress that way. And I think what you're saying there would be a great way of going about it. We could try to transform the kind of situations that usually bug us and make us more frenzied and harried, and just relax and try to work our way through it and be attentive to what's going on. Maybe that's the secret, is to substitute something. I mean, even in conversation, if you're sort of in a hurry and people want to talk, maybe if we tried to listen better at that time, we would find ourselves ourselves developing this more contemplative mode of relating. I'm thinking that, as you were talking, that it's our personal relationships where we got great opportunities to do better with that, to attend to other people's needs more, to try to be in touch with their moods and feelings, to be responsive to their requests that are either non-verbally or verbally given to us. All of that would seem to be a good way of developing this other kind of Marian spirit that we're talking about.
Seems to me that when we do that, what we really have to do is set our own agenda aside, that I really cannot really encounter another person if I'm completely into what my own agenda is, of what I've got to do and how I have to do it and how it has to work. That's too full of self, and that I have to constantly let go of that, really, to encounter another person, to enter into their space, as it were, to begin some of those ideas of taking the long, loving look, or to encounter, or just experience all that. So I think it can happen, and I guess it does mean a certain discipline, but it's a discipline, I think, that pays off, and it's something that I think that we can do and learn how to do. So I take great hope in that, because I think people once they are led to and sort of maybe even taught how to do this, it really is possible for, I think, anyone to do, not just a monk.
We can work on our prayer this way, I think, in simple ways. There's certain silence times in the celebration of the Eucharist that we could try to play to and be more attentive to those, try to make better use of those to examine our conscience or to offer our own prayers. I think in our private prayer we could improve that way. Maybe some people would find they talk to God a lot, and that it would help if we used fewer words sometimes and just try to be quiet and listen more, instead of just telling God everything we want or even thanking God or praising God. To do a little bit of that, but try to cut down the number of words and build in more quiet spaces. It's like being in the presence of a loved one, where you don't have to talk a lot, or a very familiar friend. Words aren't always necessary, but there's a certain sharing that goes on even at a nonverbal level. I think that will help with the whole contemplation thing.
I agree, and in another place, for another key idea, maybe as a way to get into contemplation, was another suggestion. And again, there were like 3 things to look at, and that was to reflect on one's roots. That when we get into the mode of reflecting, maybe as we'd done earlier, or mentioned earlier, these various people, and we get in touch with our tradition, that very act of doing that with our roots, either personally in terms of family, our background, our environment. And some of that might bring about sadness, but that's all right. Other things would bring about maybe happy memories. That's all part of it. So maybe just looking at our roots as a way to get a handle on what contemplation is about. And then what reminded me of that was the idea of looking at silence, and then from there to go into what mystery is about. So the idea of contemplation being roots, silence, and mystery.
Well, that's a good way to sum that up, Geraldine. We've been trying to look at Mary as an Advent figure. We see her as an active woman who makes a difference, but she also has this contemplative side. She's quiet and silent and prayerful, and therefore she's able to receive the Lord in a special way and share the Lord with the rest of us. And that way maybe she gives us a good example during Advent to try to develop a more contemplative life ourselves.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Sister Geraldine Nowak, who is a pastoral associate at St. Ignatius Catholic Church in Oregon, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was Mary of Nazareth, model of contemplation. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.